Again, just quickly, my name is Karen Mayfield. I'm the Executive Director of the West Florida chapter of CAI, and I want to welcome all of you to the Condo Co-op Board Certification. Again, how we're going to ask questions today is through the chat, so please use chat if you have a question. For this first section, this first 30-minute section that Lee Howe is going to be doing, we're going to hold all the questions till the end, and then I'm going to come back on and we're going to answer questions. Lee will answer your questions. Again, for all of you who are listening, please make sure that you're logged in by your name. If you can't change it, and I think you can right click on your little icon that says your name on your at the bottom of your screen. If you can change it that way, then change it that way. If not, put it in chat and I will I'll write notes and make sure that you get your certificate. With that being said, I'm going to turn it over to Lee. So take it, Lee.
Thank you, Karen. Good morning, everybody. My name's Charles Lee Howell. I'm the owner of FMS, Florida Management Services. We are a management consulting company. And I'm here today to talk to you a little bit about your elections and your requirements and your best practices for them. I don't know any other way, but just to dive right in, let's talk about your basic requirements for your election, okay? Basically what these are what entitles you and mandates you and how to hold an election. And first of all, we're going to talk, the first thing you want to think about is your corporate structure. In other words, the bylaws of the association that give you the corporate structure. That includes the title of your officers, specific powers and duties, and the manner in which you go about doing those, how many people are on your board. And at that point, let's talk about that for just a second. Normally you see a 5-person board. If you have fewer than 5 units, or I should say five or better. If you have fewer than 5 units, you may have a 3-person board if as long as you're a non-for-profit. Those 3 positions must be the president, the secretary, and the treasurer, so that you can actually handle all the duties of the company, corporation in this case. Next thing, let's define owners and investors. Who are they? Well, in condos, it's the actual owner of the unit. For co-ops, it's a little different. They're referred to as shareholders. Okay. Next point we'll discuss is your participation. We'll be covering that in further materials, and notifications. We'll also be covering that in further materials. I'm going down by the outline that was handed out to you. I think everybody should have a copy of that. If not, contact Karen later and she'll get you a copy of it. Okay. Resources for your election. These are things that will help you know what your best practices are, or in this case, what your bylaws say, which are your association governing documents. In there, they should specifically tell you how to run your election. If not, if it stays silent, then you can go to the state statute. For condos, that would be 718. For co-ops, that would be statute 719. Also, you can find a lot of help in the administrative code, and later on in when I'm speaking, I'll give you the actual number of the administration code for both. When you're getting ready to plan an election, best part, think ahead. I remember when I was in the field, I would start thinking about the annual meeting the day after I finished this year's election and think about next year and what I would do differently, or if I would make any changes. You don't have to recreate the wheel. Okay, you can modify as need be, but there's some specific things you have to know for your annual election and or your annual meeting. You have to know, get the date and time down as soon as possible. That helps a lot. And they're usually defined in your bylaws. Okay. If your bylaws stay silent on this point, just remember when you're putting it together, the place that where you hold these two events cannot be more than 45 miles away from your property. And also remember, if you're doing this, that specifically that you make sure that you're ADA compliant. We don't want anybody with disabilities not being able to get in for the meeting. Your materials that you need to gather. Right off the bat, I'm going to tell you, hire a licensed CAM manager. We're all very well versed in how to do this and what we need to have for it. And it's probably my best advice to everybody. If you should have a licensed CAM manager run these meetings. It's just definitely the best thing to do. There again, you also don't have to recreate the wheel, but usually there will be some adjustments that need to be made. Here's also something to think about. We all know of associations that are contentious. Let's just call them the Hatfields and the McCoys to put things into simpler terms. It may be necessary to have an election monitor. The state of Florida will provide you an election monitor known as an ombudsman. The ombudsman has powers that vary in range. They can monitor, they can conduct the meetings, they can enforce actions in any response that's necessary to do so in this meeting situation. They count the ballots. They also have the ability to bring in other people to make sure that the election runs smoothly. They can appoint people. They can bring in people from an attorney or any licensed person with the state to do this. The most important thing to remember about this, that all costs of this process will be borne by the association itself. So don't forget about that when you talk about getting an ombudsman. Someone's going to have to pay for it in the end. Okay, moving along. The actual statute that tells you what your elections are based upon is in 718.128 for condominiums and 719.129 for your co-ops. Okay, these are the two statutes that will tell you what the best practices or what you absolutely have to have this done. The language is in there for how to do this. Also, again, I'll give you the administrative code numbers for it, but there's also a lot from the DBPR, Department of Business and Regulation, that helps you with this, how to perform this. Okay. Each association provides each owner with and this is getting a little off track, but we're going to move to first, let's cover the electronic voting first, which are the two statutes I mentioned before. We're all moving towards electronic voting. It's one of those things that's really going to happen. And we really need to think about the things that the state is going to require for this. Right off the bat, I would recommend a third party. There are companies out here that have the programs and have the ability to do a virtual election, because there's some hurdles you have to go through with the state. One, they have to verify the person who is voting online. You have to have the ability to verify that person. The association has to be able to authenticate who exactly is voting for that particular either condo or share in the co-op. They have to be able to transmit securely. In other words, be password protected through some type of porthole. They also have to be able to count the ballots and get them back securely, and be able to store the results securely and have them available for recount. In this case, I highly recommend, again, a third party to do this. There are several. I don't have a list of them right at the moment, but it's growing daily. And we'll be all moving towards that, I think, fairly soon. So it's a good idea to start thinking about it now, because the requirements for this with the state to actually hold an online election requires that you have in writing permission from each individual owner and shareholder to participate. And this must be, when you do this, I recommend that you put a line on your information sheets. Most information sheets are renewed annually, right underneath the area where you get permission to notify them by email. You should have another line that says they would like to participate in an online voting situation. That is necessary prior to any electronic vote. That would also require from a board in advance to have this done by resolution. In other words, have a meeting of the board and by resolution vote or put in your documents that you are going to be doing the electronic voting. This must be held, must be noticed 14 days in advance. It's kind of like a budget meeting, okay? Either in person, by certified mail. And in this case, you can also do, if you're allowed, if your shareholder or owner allows you to contact them via email, you can do that as well. The process is listed, and this is what I was saying before, the administrative code 61B. That covers, it's in section 21.0021, and specific notes are somewhere, I think it's, yeah, it's in 718.112 and all the way up to 719, and I don't know where the endpoint is at for co-ops. But those are the two administrative codes that will really help you to put some of your election questions to bed. Really what happens is the legislature does administrative code, or doesn't, the legislature does the actual statute. An administrative code kind of tells you how to reach those statutes. Okay, we can start talking about your normal meeting, or what you would normally do in an election. 60 days is your first notice. Okay, I think everybody is aware of how that works. You start counting the days, the number of days prior to the date of the meeting. So you do not include the meeting date in your 60 days. Okay, what does it include? The name and correct address of the association, the date and time of the place of the meeting, deadlines for the candidates to notify you that they would like to run for office, if approved and authorized, and disclose any other deadlines you may have for your electronic election. Mode of delivery, there again, mail delivery, email transmittal, or hand delivery, all of those are acceptable. 40 days from the meeting is another deadline, and that is for the receipt of candidates to run. Within 40 days of elections, if somebody wants to run for the office, they must contact you. Okay, within the next 5 days, the eligibility of the candidate is checked to make sure that they can actually serve as a board member. And there are some things that you cannot do, be a board member for. One, you can't be a convicted felon. You cannot be removed from any other board of administration prior to becoming a candidate. In this case, in both the condos and co-ops, you must be at least current within the last 90 days. Now, here's the next one. At 35 days prior to the candidate, an information sheet goes out. This information sheet is provided by the candidate. It's a one sheet, 8.5 by 11, must be 8.5 by 11, piece of paper that the candidate puts together. And this document cannot be altered any way whatsoever. If you have misspellings, if you pour coffee on it, whatever you turn in to the association is the way it's going out. So I would be careful and have somebody proof it for you to make sure that you've got everything down that you need to have, and have it the way you'd like it to look. You can put a photograph on it. Some people do that. It's not necessary. The actual candidate information sheet is not necessary either. If you do not want to put one out, you do not have to put one out. Okay, your next mark is your 14 to 34 day period. Now, your second notice for your annual meeting that includes the agenda falls in a time period not less than 14 days and not more than 34 days prior to the meeting. That's to give the people enough time to review the materials, because in that one, that would include your instructions as well on how you're putting the vote together and so on and so forth. It also at this time lets you know if there's going to be an election. If the number of candidates is equal to or less than the number of seats that need to be filled, you don't have to have an election. We'll get back to it a little bit later about what happens if you don't have enough candidates. But generally speaking, if you have the exact number of candidates you need, you don't have to have an election. But like I said before, also in the second notice, you have to have your agenda, any election materials that need to be in there, the ballot that's listing all the candidates, and it must be in alphabetical order. The state is also very clear about this. It must be on white stock with black lettering, and you may not change font during this document. It also will contain what's known as an outer envelope. Let's call that the return envelope, or mailing envelope. It must be able to have the owner's name, unit number, and signature on it. I also recommend that when it says unit owner name, that you also make sure they print it, then sign it, and then the unit number and the address. This makes it much easier to verify who's voting and who's not voting. A proxy if necessary. Sometimes a proxy is necessary to establish how many people are voting or attending your annual and or your election. This must be separately from your ballot and contain a separate inner envelope to send back. At the very end of this, I'll tell you exactly, well, we can do it now. When you send the materials out, what needs to go back to be returned to the association is one outer envelope, which we discussed about, that has a signature on the back, a inner envelope for the ballot, and if you have a proxy, and a proxy envelope. Those things are in the return envelope and sent back or turned into the association. Okay. If you have a situation where you have, say, your condo and you have fewer than 10 units, you may opt out of this procedure and look to your bylaws to see how you may proceed with your process for naming your officers. It takes a vote of the membership to waive a couple of things, okay? And that's one of the things you have at your annual meeting, which, for instance, financial reporting. If you haven't done it at a finance meeting, you can do it at your annual. You can amend your bylaws or articles of incorporation at this time. It's just a matter of what you need to have done. and that requires a vote of the membership. Again, this has to be done with all your members. And also documents that you, how you process your documents. Let's do that next. And all your managers will know how to handle this. And it's one of the things that we're kind of drilled into our heads, is that there needs to be proof of all the notices. And it's usually done by the manager in the form of an affidavit that states how they were, when they were mailed, how they were mailed, or if they were delivered or how they were delivered. If you deliver them in person, there needs to, somebody receives it, there needs to be a signature that's saying that you received it on such and such date. There's no flexibility in this for the deadlines. The documents at that point in time are time and date stamped when they're received. And the nice thing about it is you do FedEx something like that, that makes it easier also to find out when they were received and when they were date stamped. Okay, also don't forget when you receive your candidate documents, those also have to be time and date stamped. I prefer that they be done on the back, just to make it easier and nicer looking for the person sending the document, that are reviewing the documents. Return of materials, we've gone over that. Open envelopes. Envelopes must be sealed. Please remember, inner envelopes, put the ballot, or if you have a ballot, put in the ballot envelope. If you have a proxy, put it in the proxy envelope, seal those envelopes, then put those 2 sealed envelopes in the return envelope and seal that. Everything must be sealed. It won't be counted if it's not sealed. Okay. The annual meeting itself, the night of the meeting, sign in roster. Okay, as it states, when you walk in, you sign in on a roster so that the signatures can be verified to make sure nobody has voted twice. Quorum is required for your annual meeting. It's a majority +1 for your annual meeting. Now, we haven't talked about this, but I'll do it really quick because we're on time restraint today. The annual meeting runs, most people have their annual meeting and their election at the same time, and they run concurrently. Technically, 2 different meetings, 2 different requirements. Your annual meeting needs a majority +1 to meet your quorum requirement. To hold an election, all you need is 20% of the owners to respond. So you're running 2 meetings at one time that have 2 different requirements. Just keep that in the back. Like I said, your manager will help you with this, no problem. We know how that's done. And sometimes even a quorum will be established by an attorney if one is necessary at the meeting. The election, what the requirements are to be on election committee. Okay, can't be a board member, can't be a spouse of a board member, can't be a candidate or a spouse of a candidate. I also go as far as to say no immediate family. That usually is a really good idea. When you get to the point the election materials are usually put in a bin or an election box that's locked, that stays that way until the meeting. This may be different in some cases, but if you have a question about that, please ask Karen and she'll tell me what that is, and we'll answer those questions. Then you refer to your bylaws for your agenda. It's usually spelled out quite, easily there through that, how the meeting is supposed to be run. And you then determine by closing the ballots, well, you ask for all the ballots, close your polls, and then you tender the count, which they check all the envelopes to make sure everything's what it needs to be and that nobody's voted twice. You go ahead and you will then process your ballots, count your ballots, and we will then go through announcing your new board members once they're counted. In case of a runoff, you can flip a coin. That's up to you how you want to handle that. Sometimes your documents will tell you that as well. Records, all this material that you've used for this election must be kept for at least a year. And I mean everything: outer envelopes, inner envelopes, proxies, ballots, and also any other materials. I always say put them in a box, tape it sealed, have your treasurer or your secretary, your manager, your head of your elections committee, and a member at large sign it and keep that for a year. That's so if DBPR needs to do a recount, they can get to the materials. Okay. Challenges to your election needs to be made within 60 days of the election. That's pretty self-explanatory, I think. Vacancies of the board. We talked about this quickly before. The board can appoint people if you have vacancies left over afterwards. The board can appoint somebody, and it has to be the majority of the board to appoint the new member to the board or to fill the vacancy. Board directors and hold yes.
We're at the end. We've got 3 minutes. I'm just going to ask if anybody has any questions. If not, you can go on if you've got a couple more points. If anybody has a question, please type it in chat now. Go ahead, keep going.
Okay, finish up real quick. Like I said before, 3 officers. Yeah, after that meeting's over, you need to sit down and have a organizational meeting of the new board. You need to pick at least 3 officers: a president, a secretary, and treasurer. Those are required for a non-for-profit in the state of Florida.
You have a question.
Go ahead.
You have 2 questions, actually. Do the incorporation take precedence over the bylaws?
The articles incorporation or the corporation from the state. I would say the corporation rules of the corporation do supersede the bylaws.
Okay.
In most cases.
Can the president appoint a position if empty?
It still has to be a majority of the board that appoints positions. It cannot be just the president. It has to be majority of the board.
Are the committees appointed by the board of directors? Are the committees appointed by the board of directors required to give notice, record minutes, and hold open committee meetings to the membership similar to the board of director meetings?
Yes.
Okay, keep going. I don't have any more questions.
Okay. There's only a few things left. And it's once you've got your officers and you know who they are, and you can point out who are your signatories, you need to point out who are your signatories. You can adjourn the meeting. And here's one other thing that's left after it's all over. You must be having the certification that you're of a new board member within 90 days of the election, or avail yourself of it's an affidavit that you have to send to DBPR that says that you have totally read everything and you fully understand and take full responsibility for knowing the material in there. Take the class. It's much easier, and you actually have somebody like myself that can answer your questions. If you have any more questions, please do not hesitate to get with Karen. If they're long, detailed questions, she'll let you know. She'll have a way of getting in touch with me, and I'll get back with you and tell you how or what you need to do. Some things are different, but it's best thing just to remember, use best business practices when conducting these 2 meetings.
Okay, you have one more question, Lee?
Okay.
Actually, can the president of the board make unilateral decisions and make commitments without consulting it with the rest of the board?
No.
Okay, and Sue, I don't know what this question is. I think you typed it halfway and didn't finish, so I think.
Hey, Karen, I think she was asking, is this class considered certification for the board instead of for a board member instead of signing the document? And that answer
yes.
Yes.
Yes, the answer to that is yes. Yes.
Yes, and I'm sorry, we've got a lot of material and kind of went through it over very quickly. But if you do have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact me.
Okay, thanks, Lee. I appreciate it. I just have one short housekeeping before Bill Ashby takes over. There are 3 of you that are logged in well, 2 of you logged in one by Kathy, one by Connie. Please write your full name in the chat so I know who you are. And then there's someone logged in under the number 905343. I have no idea who that is. So if you could please in the chat, put who you are. And with that being said, Bill, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great night. Thanks, everyone. Welcome. First, let me introduce myself. My name is Bill Ashby with Gulf Coast Community Management. I started Gulf Coast Community Management about just over 7 years ago. I was a board member just like you, and felt that I could do a much better job. And so I decided to start the company, and 7 years later, here I am. So I absolutely appreciate the time and effort that all of you put in to run your associations, or those that are new board members that are taking this class to prepare yourself to run your new association. It is a awesome responsibility, and you're responsible for lots of property values in your association. So thank you for joining. So the topic I'm going to talk about today is budgets and reserves. Let me just say this. There's no way I'm going to be able to get through all of the material in 30 minutes. So I understand there are a few of you that sent in the chats that you did not receive your handout. Please go back to the registration email that you received with the meeting link. I believe the packet is there. Please read all of the sections, pass it out to a board member, to your boards. Everybody really needs to take a look at this. And so, Karen, do you have something to say?
Yeah, it was. When I sent
Okay.
the email yesterday with the meeting link, there was an evaluation form and the handout attached to that email.
Okay, great. All right. So I will try to keep an eye on the chat and try to answer questions as I go, but please know that we only have about 30 minutes to get through both. So let's just get started. So what's a budget? A budget is just your tool to use to help gauge the anticipated assessments being received and your expected expenses for the coming year. When to begin your budget, really you should be monitoring your budget from day one of the new fiscal year. But about 3 to 5 months in advance gives you and the vendors enough time to talk about future contract price increases, gives the board an opportunity to determine which additional services that you need, or if you're going to have a service provider or a service go back out to quote to bid, to bring other vendors in or business partners in to work for you guys in the community. So as much time as you need to put the budget together, but 3 to 5 months is a pretty good time. So the budgets are generally broke up into 2 sections. There's an operating fund, and then there's a reserve fund. So the operating fund is your day-to-day operations, your management fees, your pool cleaning fees, your landscaping, your legal expenses. Those sorts of items are the day-to-day operation that would be considered on the operating fund. The second fund obviously is your reserve fund. So most of you should have a reserve study, or your association is reserving funds for future expenses, and we'll touch on those in a little bit. So how to prepare a budget, some hints. So the first thing is to look at where you're trending. So go back to the first day of the year, January 1. Let's say that you're in July and August and you're starting to put together some information. Start looking back to see your unanticipated expenses that have accrued, maybe some additional fertilizing that the community has decided that they want, and be sure to start adding those costs into your budget preparation for the upcoming year. And for the future, let's say this is the year that you decide, or that your association needs to have, or the following year is the year that you need to have your financials reviewed, or you've decided to have an audit. So those are what you're looking forward to in the future, to make sure that you are accounting for those expenses, so that your association doesn't experience a shortfall in the next year. So a good practice is, I know there's a lot of boards who really take the budgeting process seriously and wants to be the be-all, end-all when it comes to determining the budget, which technically the board does approve the budget. But it is always a great idea to have budget workshops leading up to the first draft. invite homeowners to sit on a committee, have open board meetings or dialogues with homeowners to talk about what they expect, because they are essentially paying the assessments. And so I think that's a great thing to do. So I did just see a question come up. Let me just jump in. Yes, you can quote unquote borrow money from the reserves, but there are procedures that you must have in place. So at the annual meeting or at a membership meeting, one of the things that you can have your manager add on as a vote is to allow borrowing of reserve funds for emergency expenses or insurance expenses. Some of our associations borrow money from the reserve account because their assessments are due and their insurance premium is due in the first 3 months of the year. Well, you obviously haven't collected $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 in insurance premium because you're starting your year. So they would quote unquote borrow from the reserves. They can either take the money from the reserve account, or they just won't make their annual contribution to the reserves until later on in the year, just to make sure that they can pay the insurance. And there are benefits to do that. The number one benefit is, one, you're not paying finance charges on your insurance premium. So that's a great savings, but you are reducing the amount of interest that you're earning in your reserve account, which I think we can all agree would be amounts to pennies now. So there you go. So moving on, there's another question that says, would I recommend a line item for reserve insurance deductibles? I don't really think that's necessary, especially if you have reserves. I mean, you could do that, but I don't, none of my associations do that. I do not think that's a good idea, but that is something that you can talk to your legal team and your management company and your board to determine if you want to have a line item in your reserves for some kind of catastrophic event for deductible. So that's generally what your reserves are used for. So, all right, so the budget format, the statutes have just some items are listed in your handout. Please be sure to read that. You are looking at, you want to make sure that you're including all the common expenses for the year. You want to make sure, and they're listed on an individual basis. So the more detailed budget that you have offers that much more transparency in where the expenses are and how the expenses are incurring over the year. So you want to have, on an annual basis, all of your contracts listed, the beginning and ending dates of the period covered on the budget. And this one I see often. Sometimes I see a budget and it says 2019 annual budget, or let's just use 2021 annual budget. Well, the 2021 annual budget generally begins on January 1 to December 31st. That's if you have a typical calendar year budget. But there are some of our associations that have a fiscal year, and a fiscal year is any 12-month period for your accounting. So some of our associations start on April 1st. Some of our associations start on July 1st, and we actually have one that starts in the late summer. So even though they've started in 2021, that's considered 2021. So you want to make sure that the dates are listed for the period that the 2021 budget. So if it's 1/1 through 12/31, 2021, that's great. If it's July 1st, 2021 through June 30, 2022, that is considered your 2021 budget. So there, some of the errors, as I just stated, was the date, but another error is including all of the line items that are listed in the Florida statutes of administration of the association, management fees, maintenance, rent, or for recreational and other commonly used facilities, taxes upon the association property, if you have any property that the association owns, taxes on leased areas, insurance, security provisions, any other general expenses that you incur over the year, your operating capital, your reserves, and your fees payable to the division. Those are just some of the items that are sometimes not listed in your budget, but greater detail always helps you determine how to set your budget up for the future, for the next year. You have detailed, the more detail you have, the easier it is to plan. So In condos, one of the things that you will have to confirm with your legal team is how to calculate your assessments. So some are talking about the number, first you're talking about the total budgeted expenses plus the number of units equals the annual assessment per unit. And some condominiums have it to where they're by square footage within the unit size. So those are some of the questions that if you and your management team, it never hurts to ask your legal representatives to help you determine on how to calculate those if your association has those items on there. So let's talk about reserves. So reserves are just monies that are set aside for specific expenses for capital items, whether they're deferred maintenance or capital expenses. Now, 718 and 719, they talk about what will actually go in to the associate, to your reserves, and it's really anything that where the expected cost is going to be more than $10,000, whether it's deferred maintenance or capital expenditure items. You can have items that are less than that, than the 10,000, but that's a pretty good rule to use for the 10,000. Other than that, it would just be line items in your budget. So some of our associations, we recommend all of our associations to have a professional company come in and create your reserve study. There are some associations where they have experience and they go to, they create their own reserve studies, and there's nothing wrong with that. They update it every single year, but those board members may not always be on the board. And so it's nice to have a reference or a guide to follow for which items are included in the budget. You have a professional company, generally engineers, that come out to assess the life expectancy of your units. And this helps the association remove some of that liability from maybe causing an unexpected future special assessment. So, but here we go. Why do you have reserves? Well, number one reason is to save money now for future expenses, which will help prevent having any special assessments. And special assessments, when you start getting into multiple special assessments, that could absolutely hurt your property values in your community. Not having adequate reserves can also hurt the property values of your community. Buyers now are better prepared to ask this question, and that is, how much money is in the reserves? What is the percent funded in the reserves? And what is your total percent funded in the reserves as to how close are you to being 100% funded? All of those, depending on how you answer those questions, your property values are going to drop. And the reason why is that the owners feels like the buyers feel like they need to have some sort of credit given back to them because they're going to anticipate the reserves special assessment, or they see that the reserves are underfunded, which will mean future increases in the reserve contribution. So funding reserves anywhere between 80 and 100% is always a good idea to do. So waiving or reducing reserves. So let's just say that there's a budget crunch and the contribution for the reserve, let's just say that it's $10,000 for the year, and there are some expected expenses for the coming year, which may, where the board decides that they do not want to increase the assessments. So the one way that the board can do that is to recommend to the membership to reduce the reserves of the funding. I do not recommend doing that, but sometimes that is what you have to do. So the membership at a duly called membership meeting, 14-day notice, just following the meeting notice requirements, can vote to waive or reduce the reserves. Again, I don't recommend that. Before you do that, please make sure that you have a good conversation with your property manager and your legal team just to make sure that that is something that you guys should do. So estimating reserves, like I said, some of our associations that create their own reserve study, they do a pretty, somewhat adequate job to make sure that they've included new contracts, new updated costs of replacements, and then factor in the life expectancy to get what you need for that year's annual contribution. Your reserve study, as I said earlier, does that for you. There is no guesswork. We do recommend having your reserve study updated at a minimum every 3 years, but that really depends on how many projects you've completed over the next year. So let's say that you've got your reserve study, you just completed in 2021. Let's say that you have painting you're being done, your roofs are also due, you've replaced the asphalt, or you've sealed the asphalt, and you've expended a lot of money from your reserves. That, regardless of when you previously did your reserves, is a great opportunity to reset your reserve expenses to begin saving for the next events. So the reserve specialist would come in, they would see how many expenses you're having this year, what your assessments are, which items were repaired or which maintenance was done, reestablish the future replacement or maintenance timelines, and then reset your budgets to make sure that you're prepared for the next year. So I got a question. Let me just take a look at this. It says, the question is, what is a good practice on allocation when you have a portion of your community that is waterfront and a portion that is not? Jose, I'm not really sure what you're asking. Are you asking for reserves, allocation of your reserves, or for the actual assessments? Go ahead and answer that. Oh, allocation of assessments. Well, there really isn't, unless your governing document states, and maybe this is a question you could ask the attorneys during their section, is you can't really charge unit owners more because they're on waterfront versus unit owners that are not on waterfront, unless your document states that those units pay more because they generally, probably, I've never seen that. I've only seen it where there are based on square footage, but that is something that you need to have addressed with your legal team and then review your documents. All right, so moving on. The reserve schedule. The reserve schedule is, it just tells you, it lists all of your capital improvements, all of your items, I should say, that are in your reserve study. It lists the useful life left, when was the last replacement or maintenance done on it, how much money is in the account, when is it going to be the life expectancy, and how much money is it going to take to repair that again in the future. That is really your reserve schedule. It also lists your annual contributions, beginning on 2021 to 2022, 2023, and it goes all the way down for 30 years. You're not going to use that schedule the entire 30 years because you're going to have to do some updating, but that definitely gives you an idea of where you're at. Now, I want to just mention this, that some reserve specialists include interest earned from your reserve account into your contributions. Some reserve specialists will not include the amount of interest potentially earned because it is a potential number and they can't qualify that. So just make sure that you're aware of that. When it comes out, the interest is not that much. That would make a difference in the amount of your reserve contribution, but that is something that you should look at. So calculating the reserves, there are two different ways. There's the straight line component method, and then there's a pooling method. The state prefers the pooling method, and this is, and pooling method actually gives you a little bit more flexibility as an association. So let's say that you have an unexpected road replacement that comes up, but your building maintenance, all of your other accounts are fully funded if you're using the straight line method, but your roads, you're $30,000 short to do your roads from the road reserve account. And straight line and component funding, you technically cannot borrow money from one of the other reserve accounts without an approval of the association members at a membership meeting to do that. Pooling removes that. It allows the owners to move everything over to pooling, which means that although you are funding for each item listed, but it's in a pool. So if something comes up a year or two earlier that has to be replaced, you're just using the total amount of funds in your reserve account to pay for that either deferred maintenance or capital improvement. And then again, as I've stated a couple of times, please make sure that you update your reserve study that following year or that year when something like that happens. So I'm just going through to see what else. We're getting close to the end, and I want to make sure I save some time for questions. So the rest of the reserve section really gives you directions on how to create the reserve study yourself and what's listed. I'd rather not talk about those specific details and just open up the line, open up some questions. I think I pretty much hit on all of those. Determine the estimated useful life of each item, determine the estimated remaining useful life of each item, and then the number of columns and the projected annual cash outflows. All of that stuff is in a reserve study. So that's really all I have on the budget and reserves. I do have another question here. It's on our community, we are from the waterfront. It says, on our community, we are a co-op. Waterfront shares cost 30% more than the land units. Should they be assessed 30% more on the assessments if we use share price as a basis? I do not know the answer to that, actually, Jose. Lee Howell is on here. I know he specializes in co-op. So maybe at the end of our segment, if Lee wants to jump in and say that, or if one of the other attorneys wants to jump in, but I cannot answer that question.
I think Lee logged off. I don't think he's here anymore.
All right, so Mel asked the question, is there a rule of thumb when you have to start reserving for a particular item, roof, like a roof? Alternatively, upon installation of a new roof, do you immediately need to start reserving again, even if the useful life is 30 years? Mel, my answer to that is absolutely yes. You're protecting not only you, if you plan to live there for another 30 years, but future owners in the community. So when you replace a roof, this is one of the items that will be addressed by your reserve specialist. So when you replace a roof, you're basically now starting to take an anticipated cost to replace the roof 30 years from now, and you're starting to save for it now. So just if you were going to go on vacation and you're going overseas next year, you're going to probably start putting a little money back every single month to make sure every single month to make sure that you can do that comfortably. That is the same way you need to look at it with reserves. So yeah, start reserving for a capital item as soon as you know that it needs to be reserved for. Another question, Bob Hart, do you recommend independent budget reviews? None of my associations have done that. I wouldn't say that's not a good idea, but I would say that a budget review, generally speaking, you have several people looking at that. You have your property manager, you may have the community or a committee, a budget committee look at that. And then obviously all of your homeowners are going to be reviewing your budget. If you're having some fiscal issues with balancing your budget, maybe you should seek somebody, a consultant, to come in and help you determine why you're not being able to maintain your budget. A lot of times, and I'm not saying this is for you, Bob, but a lot of times associations will throw a number without doing any research to tell the owners that they balance the budget, knowing that they are not going to hit that number. And that is not a way to set up a budget. So yes, if you're having problems or if your board is having problems, please reach out to a consultant to help you with that. So, all right, any other questions?
Bill, let's ask Scott if he might know the answer to Jose's question.
Absolutely.
Scott, we had a question, allocation of assessments on our community. We are a co-op. Waterfront shares cost 30% more than the land units. Should they be assessed 30% more on the assessment if we use share price as the basis?
My off the cuff answer is no, but you really need to sit down with your association counsel and go over that question. It depends what your documents say and the restrictions on what is an assessment and how you assess your members. I think that's impossible to answer without reviewing the documents.
Okay, thanks. And Bill, you have one last question. How many months of budgeted expenses should be held?
12 months. I think that's what you're asking, Mark. Yes, you definitely want to budget your expenses over the 12-month period, which is the accounting period, whether it's a fiscal year or starting on the calendar year.
Okay,
let's
and
hear.
one more.
How does 80% rule come into play in first year of starting to reserve for a new roof? First year should be 10,000 as a minimum reserve, at least 8,000. I'm not sure what you mean by the 80% rule. I don't know if you're referring to when I mentioned 80% funding. When, let's just say that your roof is going to cost you $10,000 in 5 years and you have yet to start funding, just basic math would take 5 years, $10,000, $2,000 a year, and the association should be funding $2,000 every year to make sure you have 10,000 in 5 years to do that. The 80%, if you, I'm just assuming that's what you're referring to on the funding part is how much money you're contributing. So let's say that the association does not want to fund 100%, which would be $2,000 a year, but yet they want to fund it at 80%. So instead of contributing $2,000 each year to get you to the 10,000 in 5 years, you're going to fund $1,600 for each year. So you can make sure, even though you'll be short, but maybe you're hedging that you're going to have additional funds in your reserves to help offset that and to help offset any increases in your operating budget. So Mel, if that didn't answer your question, you can get with Karen and she can give you my information if you need another question answered. So.
Okay, great.
All right, guys. Hey, thank you guys. I appreciate the time and thank you for attending today.
Thanks, Bill. Appreciate it. And with that being said, Scott, I'm going to turn it over to you. If you want to just tell them a little bit about who you are and what you do, that would be great before you start.
Sure. My name's Scott Peterson. I'm an attorney here in Sarasota. I have my own practice, the law office of Scott K. Peterson. I practice almost exclusively in the area of condos and HOAs. I'm board certified in condominium law and planned development law, as well as business litigation. So I handle both the day-to-day advice to condo boards, as well as advising boards on litigation when it comes to that, or conducting litigation if it comes to that. Hopefully not, of course. And that's actually a good segue into my topic, which is official records. And I think Karen alluded to the fact that there's quite a few more disputes, it seems, right now between owners and boards and between neighbors. But I see a lot of boards struggling with particular owners. And official records are one of those areas that if you have a problem owner in your community, they're going to use this section to, I wouldn't say harass the board, because owners do have let's start from the proposition that owners have the right to inspect official records. They're the members of the association. They have the right to look at the documents. So nobody questions that. But what you'll find is if you do get an owner who's in a dispute with the board, they have a tendency to make excessive and repeated requests to inspect the official records. The problem with the official records section is there are a couple areas in which there are sort of landmines. And if you don't handle these correctly, it can be used against the board, and you don't want that to happen. You can avoid those landmines by just, following the statute and the rules. But there are times where questions come up, and hopefully we'll put some of those questions to rest today. You'll see the definitions in 718, 719, 720 for official records. I'm going to refer a lot in just to the condo section, which is 718, 111, 12. But the Homeowners Act section is almost the same. The Cooperative Act section is a little different, but not very different. But the first thing all three of those acts do is they specify what is an official record. Now, it seems kind of basic. I mean, the governing documents, of course, the minute book, the roster, your insurance policies, a copy of your plans, your permits, your warranties provided by the developer, that sort of thing. All that is sort of elementary. You go down the list, current copy of the management agreement is one. Bills of sale, if there's any transfer of property owned by the association, accounting records, of course. Ballot sign-in sheets and voting proxies are a special category. Most records, and I'll refer to this a little later, most records have to be kept for 7 years. Ballot sign-in sheets, voting proxies, anything related to voting have to only be kept for 1 year. So just basically for the last election. And that's something to keep in mind. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But there's a provision in all three of those sections, the Condo Act, the Cooperative Act, the Homeowners Association Act. I want to draw your attention to. It's usually the last in the list, and it's one of those things that that will drive you crazy if you don't pay attention to it. And for example, in the Homeowners Act, it says all other records of the association related to the operation of the association. Well, that's super general, super broad. All records of the association related to the operation of the association. So it gives you this long laundry list of things, but anything else, basically, any other documents that you generate as an association or you keep to refer to while you're managing the association, all those documents are part of the official records too. So that's something to keep in mind. A lot of times owners will ask for inspections of official records, and it will include things that are not in the list. Don't fall into the trap of saying, well, if it's not in the list, I don't have to provide it. It's not true. If it's something you keep as an association, you refer to as an association, or you use that document in your operations, it's an official record. So you've got to provide access to that as well. A question always comes up, what if I don't have a record? Something in that laundry list that just we don't have. We're a new board perhaps, or a new management company comes in, and we look at the records and we can't find one of these items. Now the law in this is pretty clear. You as the association do not have to create a record that you don't possess. But that said, if you have, for example, let's say you don't have a current roster of owners for your condominium because the last board didn't create it, and an owner says, I want to see the current roster. Well, in that case, you probably do have to create it because it is a record that you're required to have. But there are other cases where owners will ask to inspect records that you just don't possess or you never had. In that case, you don't have to create things out of thin air. You don't have to create things that you're not required to keep, for example. Owners sometimes think that you have records that you don't. And of course, all of these fine distinctions, these are places where you really got to work with your association council to make sure that you're producing everything that you have a duty to produce. One thing to keep in mind, one problem area in association record keeping is, what do we do about emails? You will frequently see owners requesting copies of all emails. Now, it's clear that all emails that come to the association, whether they come to a manager or they come to a board member, anything incoming is considered an official record. The question comes up, what if it's a communication from board member to board member, or owner to board member, or board member to owner? What about all those? The answer is a little bit unclear. The statute doesn't provide us with much guidance in this area. There's really not been much case law in the Florida courts. There has been quite a bit written in the arbitration cases for condominiums. Now, those only apply to condominiums. They can be persuasive authority in cooperatives and in homeowners association cases, but they're not, they're not gospel. But in the condo world, what the division has said is well, if you have a computer that is funded by, paid for by the association, such as a manager's computer, anything generated by that computer, any emails generated by that computer are automatically official records. But personal emails of members of the boards of directors are not owned by the association. There's no requirement that those directors ever produce those emails or make those emails available to the association or anything like that. So if it's a personal email of a board member, that is not considered an official record. That said, let me just give you a word of caution here. We're just talking about inspection of official records. You know, can an owner request, can I see all that board member's emails to and from the other directors on such and such an issue? The answer is no, those are not official records. But if you enter into a lawsuit and you get into the court system and you're in the midst of litigation and an owner sues the association for something and has a discovery request or issues a subpoena and says, I want to see all that board members' emails that refer to this this incident in this date range, you're going to have to produce those once you're in court. So one tip for your board members is this: have a special email address just directed to your board duties. President Happy Land Association at gmail.com, something like that. And use that exclusively for your communications to other board members or to the managers or to owners when it refers to association business. And the reason for that is, if, God forbid, you're in the midst of a lawsuit and you're asked to produce your emails for inspection, you have them all in one place. You have them all under one address. You don't have to search through all your personal emails and take out all the stuff that goes back and forth to your grandkids and that sort of thing. That's a headache you don't want to face. It's an easy thing to do to set up a new Gmail account for your board member duties. So I encourage you to do that. Emails are, when you get the court system, if you think they're a pain in the inspection realm, they're really a pain when you get into litigation. So be on the lookout for that. Another thing is, in this age of email, it is easy to provide electronic copies to your owners. Now, one thing in the condo world is, now that you're required to keep a website, certain of your official records have to be on the website. Your condo docs, your governing documents, your budget, your financials, notices, agendas. There's kind of a list of things that have to be provided on that condominium website. That actually makes your life easier. And if you're a cooperative or an HOA, you might want to think about having a website rather than constantly having your manager or having a board member have to search through official records and provide them to folks who request them. Easy enough to have a sign-in system where only your members can access them, but they can instantly get to your governing documents, instantly get to notices of meeting minutes, all this stuff that you can put on your website. You don't have to spend time as a manager or a board member going back and reinventing the wheel. Any owner can log in and see all that stuff. If you don't have a website or that sort of thing, and you have an official records request, you do not have a duty to search through the official records and provide specific records to anybody and email them. You can do that, but you don't have a duty to do that. So one thing you can do, especially when it comes to owners who request a large volume, to review a large volume of records, you can make them available, bankers boxes, or if you have them digital, you can pull them all up on PDFs on the association computer and have the owner come in. They can review them all. They have the right to make copies if they don't have copies. You can charge them a reasonable rate for making copies if you want to. But you don't have to go through, if you have an owner who has requested dozens and dozens and dozens of categories of records and separate records, you don't have to spend your time pulling all that stuff out. In the HOA world, you can charge a reasonable fee if assembling those records costs you time and money. And again, this is something you want to review with your association counsel, but there is a provision for, doing that sort of effort, but you can't simply charge people, $100 to review the records. They have the right to see the records. So you can't charge them just for the privilege of inspecting records. but in some cases can charge them for the effort of assembling those records. Hang on one second. So some practical advice. Some things you should do is just best practices. Enforce the statutory requirements across the board. Even if it's a request from a director to inspect official records, or from a friendly, owner. If you don't want to get in the habit of having to produce records at the drop of a hat for everybody, treat everybody the same. Make them all go through the steps. The request has to be in writing. Is an email a request in writing? I think most cases it probably is. But make them send you an email and keep the record that they made the request in writing. You as a board should probably put together a policy on the inspection of records, and do that before you get into conflict with a certain owner. Have a policy. How frequently can members request inspections? Can they do it 3 times a month? Can they do it 5 times a month? Can they do it only once a month? Those are decisions that you should come to as a board in association with your attorney. How long can they inspect records? How many records can they see at one time? All those things, there are ways in which you can kind of put some parameters on official record inspections, and really good idea to do that in advance of issues. So have a policy and enforce that policy. One thing that comes up quite frequently is remember that only owners can inspect the official records. Now, can their attorney inspect official records? In my policy as an association attorney is, if an owner's attorney requests on behalf of their owner to inspect official records, I always let them. I don't see what the issue is. I don't necessarily let, if it's someone related to the owner, I don't do that unless they have a power of attorney. But if it's an attorney, or if it's an accountant or an expert or something like that the owner is hired, I do let them do that as long as I have confirmation from the owner that this person represents them in an official capacity. Otherwise, just to owners. And that means, for example, if you have buyers coming into your community, and they come to you as the manager or board member, and they say, hey, I'm looking to buy this unit or this home in your community. I want to look at your official records. The answer to that is no. They cannot inspect your official records because they're not owners yet. What you need to do in those cases is say there are, by statute, your duties to prospective purchasers are to provide an estoppel certificate that says there is this much owed on this unit or this house or whatever, and there are these violations. And that's about all the information that you can communicate to them. And the response to that buyer or that buyer's realtor will have to be, look, you can get that information from the seller. You have to go back to the seller. If you want the seller to provide you with that information, you have to have the seller come in, make the copies of the records that you're looking to see, and then provide those to you. But you should not be providing access to prospective purchasers. The big problem area comes in timing of these requests. And you're supposed to provide them within 5 business days of a request. But if you don't provide them within 10 business days of the request, you can incur statutory fines. And there's a legal presumption that you failed to provide those records intentionally. You can rebut that. There are occasions, we're in the midst of a hurricane and I couldn't provide the records, something like that. But in the absence of a good explanation, you have a duty to provide them within 10 days. If you don't, there's a statutory fine of $50 a day for the next 10 days that you don't provide the records, so up to $500. Now, $500 is not that big a deal in the grand scheme of things, but here's the kicker. They're also entitled to their reasonable attorney's fees. And the reason why this gets to be a little sticky is if you've got an owner who is in some sort of conflict and is looking to sue the association, one of the things that their attorney might do is try and hook you on one of these official records inspections. And if you blow the deadline, you know, it says they're entitled to their reasonable attorney's fees. Well, I've seen some pretty outrageous amounts charged or allegedly charged to owners for conducting records inspections. So don't fall into that trap. You know, provide the date. All you have to do once you get the written request to inspection to inspect the records, find a date within 5 days and say 9 a.m. You know, my office. You can come in and look at them. And if they call you back and say, well, I can't meet it on that day, then you're kind of off the hook. Then you can find a convenient day together that's beyond the date range. But your duty is to provide a time within that date range. If they say, I can't make it in that time, I need to schedule a later time, you're covered. Another thing you have to do, you have to have a record retention policy. You should have one as a board. If you don't, work with your attorney, get a record retention policy. Why? Because the statute requires you to keep official records for 7 years. Though, except for example, your governing documents, you have to keep all the time. Your permits, warranties from developers, your minute book, those you have to keep for eternity. But your other official records, you don't have to keep beyond 7 years. So, you know, even though we're in the digital age and it's a lot easier to store records digitally than, you know, have bankers boxes full of documents. By the way, nobody should have bankers boxes full of documents that are older than 7 years unless they're required to be kept. If you've got boxes and boxes of old stuff, you gotta find time to sit down and go through that stuff and get rid of all that material. If you don't need it, if you need it, keep it, of course. But if you don't need it, get rid of it. There's no sense paying for the storage fees for old, outdated records. Get them scanned, get them digital if you have to keep them, but don't incur storage fees for all this stuff. And like I said, the only exception to the 7-year rule, things from your election, ballots, sign-in sheets, voting proxies, all that stuff related to voting in your last election, you got to keep that for 1 year only. And again, at the end of the year, get rid of it. You don't have to keep it under the statute, so why keep it around? Have a policy, have a time. You know, maybe it's the couple weeks after your annual election. You know, when the new board is in place, have a document review and destruction to get rid of that old stuff and clear it out, because you don't want to keep it around if you don't have to. One other thing to keep in mind here, excluding what don't you have to provide. There are some exclusions in the statutes. There are categories of records that you not only don't have to provide, you shouldn't provide, and you're prohibited from providing. The obvious one is attorney-client privilege documents. Communications to and from your counsel to get legal advice. You know, not only the opinion letter from your attorney, but all the emails that ask questions about it and lead up to it. Anything that can be construed as a communication to obtain legal advice, all that stuff is excluded and should not be provided. You shouldn't keep it in the official records. You should keep it separate. If you've got, you know, a folder or an electronic folder or a physical folder of attorney opinions or attorney letters or anything like that, keep that well separate from everything else so you don't accidentally provide it. The reason why is not only can you not provide it under the code, but if you provide attorney-client privileged information outside of the attorney-client privilege bubble, you can waive attorney-client privilege. And that means they can go and depose your attorney, and you don't want to do that. This brings up another point. This is sometimes confusing for owners. Attorneys represent the board. So we're the attorney for the board. We only have attorney-client privilege with the board and the manager. We don't have an attorney-client relationship with the owners. And the owners will often say things like, well, you know, we pay your fees, so you should talk to us and you should provide us with legal opinions or information. That's not how that works. You know, we represent the corporation as represented by the board. So we only have attorney-client privilege with board members. That's one reason why if an owner comes in and wants to see, that opinion letter that attorney provided, that I paid for, which they'll often say, you not only don't want to provide that, you can't provide for a number of reasons. So don't do that. If you have any questions, call your attorney. Make sure they're on board and they understand what their request is. There are materials you receive for approvals of leases and sales. A lot of that is, background check information, personal information like that. That cannot be kept in the official records or provided. Personnel records, any employees of the association or management company employees that work for the association, all that stuff is not official records, and disciplinary action, attendance records, anything like that, all that stuff is excluded from the official records. But the management contract, the contract with the management company, that is an official record. That should be part of your official records. But any other personnel records or discussions of personnel issues, that has to be kept confidential. Medical records. One of the big issues, as we all know, are emotional support animals. And folks will send you prescriptions from their doctor saying, I have anxiety and I need a reasonable accommodation, exemption from the no pet rule so I can keep my dog to keep my anxiety down. All those communications concerning medical diagnoses, that sort of thing, protected by HIPAA, that is not part of your official records. Again, keep that outside, separate from your official records, so you don't inadvertently, accidentally provide some other owner access to somebody's medical records. Personal identifying information, social security numbers, credit card numbers, driver's license numbers, email addresses, addresses up north that they don't want, they haven't provided as their general, like to a directory or something like that. Phone numbers, any of that stuff, anything that the owner, there's a list of this stuff in the code that's exempt, but anything that an owner provides for contact to the association should not be disseminated to the rest of the association without that owner's approval. And of course, any security data, passwords, for the association side, any management passwords and that sort of thing is not subject to inspection and should not be provided, of course. I do see some questions, so I'll try and wrap this up real quick, and we'll get to the questions. And I think I've gone through this, but make sure the things that you need as a board, I think you really do need to sit down with your attorney and you need a policy on inspection of official records. You need a policy on the storage and maintenance of those records, and you need to follow those policies and make sure you go over those periodically. And let me get to
the first question, Scott.
Go ahead.
My understanding of the Florida statute is that all contracts of the association have to be made available to the members of the association. Is it legal for the association to charge money to provide those records? Do employee contracts fall under this category of disclosure?
Well, like I said, the management company is an official record. Any contract with the management company, that's an official record and has to be maintained. General contracts, there are some general contracts that have to be part of the official records. And I think almost every contract falls into the category of at least the catch-all provision. That is, something we use and rely on in the course of business. So yeah, I think all those have to be part of the official records and have to be kept for 7 years.
But you can't charge money to provide those records, can you?
No, you can't provide, you can charge for copies. You can't charge for the inspection. So they can come, owners can come in, they can look at all those contracts and that sort of thing. If the owner wants to make their own copies, they can bring in their own copier or scanner or whatever. But you can charge them, a quarter a page or whatever it is to make copies if they don't have that.
And you said management companies, but what about individual managers? The same?
Individual managers, for example, as a hired manager who works exclusively for the association.
Yep.
My attitude towards that is that's a personnel record. So you're an employee of the association, that has to be confidential.
Okay. Next question. Do rules and regulations need to be recorded in the land records similar to the declaration?
They do,
And
for both
articles of
condos and HOAs. Yeah.
Okay. Bylaws and articles of incorporation. Yep, everything. Who bears the cost of document creation?
Generally speaking, the association, and remember that that's only as to documents you're required to have. So for example, like my example was, if you don't have a roster in your condo of owners and somebody requests to see the roster, you can't charge back that owner for creating that roster because you were supposed to have it anyway.
Oh, this is good. Our HOA has had 3 different management companies in the past 4 years. Most of our minute records are gone. Is that a problem?
That is a problem.
It's a problem.
Yeah, you should work with your attorney to make contact with those former managers and try and get whatever draft minutes you can and reassemble them to the extent that you can.
Condo association, do rules have to be the same for owners and renters? For example, can an association have a different pet policy for owners and renters?
You can't.
Can't?
No.
Do you need to archive emails for a certain amount of time?
Generally, it's 7 years. If it's an email that's required to be kept as an official record, like I said, there's all this controversy about that. But if it's, for example, an email from a manager on an association-owned computer, 7 years.
What is the reference for requiring an association website? Does a Facebook page qualify?
It does not. There is a section in, I think it's under 718.111. I'm not sure exactly which subsection, but it's in there that you have to have a website as a condo.
Are we obligated to provide age information of a given member?
No. If there is if this refers to like a 55 and over community, I would refer that to your counsel. In general, I would not provide that information.
When a request is made for emails, how broad is the duty to disclose board member emails? So I guess someone is requesting emails, and do you disclose board member emails?
Again, this goes back to our discussion about what emails are official records. If it's just the personal email of a board member, generally speaking, it is not an official record.
RE vote docs and 1-year retention, are all vote records discarded after 1 year? Only board candidate vote records? I'm not sure.
All those things, all ballots, proxies,
everything.
Yeah.
If you hire your own manager, is that employment contract protected, or is?
I believe it is.
Yeah, we already answered that. Does that become official record? No. Should background check information of new members be destroyed or return after approval of membership?
I believe it should be retained for 7 years, but not as part of the official records. I think you should retain that information, but it's not an official record.
Okay. Can letters of resignation, termination of employees be shared with shareholders?
Say that one again, Karen, I'm sorry.
Can letters of resignation or termination of employees be shared with shareholders? I would say.
Letters of resignation, yes. I think they can be considered personnel records. I think letters of termination are certainly personnel records.
Yeah.
Resignation, I think you're on the bubble. I would have to look at that a little more carefully.
Okay, and we probably only have time for like one more question, and I'm sorry, there are several here because we need to get Mary up. Residents have asked to identify anyone with COVID. Can management disclose that info?
No. That falls under what we were talking about, health records.
Right.
Don't disclose that.
Okay. Mary, are you there? She has not logged on yet. Okay. Where in the sec-
I'm here. I'm here.
There you are. Okay.
Now, all the tough questions have to go to Mary, right, Karen?
Yeah, the tough questions have to go to Mary. And actually, we don't have time for any more questions. I'm
No
sorry,
problem.
everyone. But Scott, thank you so much. I greatly appreciate it. And
Take
with
care.
Mary, I'm going to turn it over to you. Will you just give them a little bit of information of who you are and what you do?
I was trying to find the answer to the Sunshine Law question that came.
Oh, the Sunshine Law question.
It is in 112, 718, 112 about committees having to be in the sunshine too. But anyway, hi, I'm Mary Hawk with Porges Hamlin Knowles and Hawk Law Firm, and we represent a lot of community associations up and down the West Coast. We're also a full service law firm. We have estate planning and real estate attorneys also, which help greatly in our association practice too. I've been a member of CAI, a past board member, a past president, and like giving these talks because I like to have board members be educated and certified. And I would recommend you take more than one of these board certification classes. There's actually 3 other topics that aren't on today's agenda. You only get 4 topics at a time. So if you see the condo board certification offered again, and it's the 3 other topics that you haven't gotten, I would recommend you go to that. And then if you're on the board for multiple years, do it each year. It really is good to keep you up to date. So anyway, I'm here to talk about dispute resolution. And Karen and I were discussing earlier this morning that it seems in this past year of COVID, tempers have flared a lot, and just about no one is getting along, from the top down. So the topic that we teach in board certification, and these are topics that the state has told us to teach. This one's called Condominium Cooperative Association Dispute Resolution. So how do you resolve these disputes? And what we're going to talk about today are disputes between owners, your members, and your association. But I'm going to throw in some other hints for resolving disputes, maybe between two owners, or disputes between the association and perhaps a vendor that you're having too. But let's start with what I've found out is most people don't know the difference between mediation and arbitration. They are 2 different things, and most people sort of throw those terms around interchangeably, but they're not. They're 2 completely different things. They're both considered alternative dispute resolution. Mediation is an informal, voluntary process where the parties come together. They meet with a neutral third party called a mediator, and the neutral is not associated with either party, doesn't have any dog in the fight, and is trained and certified, and I'm a certified mediator, to sit down and try to settle these people's disputes. And the mediator doesn't make any decisions. The mediator doesn't say you're right and you're wrong, or this is how it should be done. The mediator just has a lot of tools to help the 2 sides come together and come to a settlement, which can hopefully be reduced to writing and be a settlement agreement. And when it's reduced to writing, it becomes an enforceable contract. So if you reduce a mediated settlement to writing and one party doesn't hold up their end of the bargain, you can take that settlement agreement to court and enforce it. What arbitration is more like a court process. An arbitrator or a panel of arbitrators will listen to both sides, sometimes take evidence. It's a little more informal than a court process, but it is very much like a court process in that the arbitrator is going to make a decision and adjudicate the problem and say who wins. And what we have to deal with as condominiums and co-ops is a mandatory arbitration provision in the statute. So under 718.1255 is the Florida statutes, is the dispute resolution section, and the co-op dispute resolution section says follow 718.1255. So condos and co-ops both follow 718.1255. And that statute says there are certain disputes between the association and a member that are required to go to mandatory non-binding arbitration before either side can file an action in court. So it's mandatory pre-suit mediation, pre-suit arbitration, but it's called non-binding, but we'll get into that in a minute. The biggest question under that statute is, what is a dispute that falls under that statute that requires you to go to arbitration first? And the arbitration you're going to go to is with the Department of Business and Professional Regulation, or the DBPR, the Division of Condominiums up in Tallahassee. You don't go to Tallahassee. It's all done on paper, by phone, I guess by Zoom these days too. But that's the Division of Condominiums up there. That's who administers this arbitration process. So you read the statute and say, well, we're having a dispute with one of our owners, or one of our owners is having a dispute with us. And is this a dispute that requires us to go to arbitration first before we can go to court and ask for some sort of court order? And those disputes are the typical, when the association is trying to get the owner to do something or not do something regarding their unit. So that's the usual, you know, we're a no pet condo and you have a pet and you won't get rid of the pet, or you have an unapproved tenant and we require tenant approvals, or you enclosed your lanai and you didn't get permission. So those kinds of things where you're trying to get the owner to comply with your covenants and they're not, that requires pre-suit arbitration. Disputes where an owner might say that the board or the association took it upon themselves to materially alter some common element without getting the unit owner vote that's required, then the member, the unit owner, can bring that dispute in arbitration against the association. Other disputes that members can bring against the association that must go to arbitration first are if you fail to properly conduct your elections, if you fail to give adequate notice of your meetings, or you fail your board meetings, or you fail to properly conduct your board meetings, you fail to allow the inspection of the books and records like Scott was talking about, or if in some instances of a recall, if a board member is being recalled. Those are all disputes under the statute that must be first submitted to arbitration before any other type of lawsuit or anything like that can be filed. The kind of dispute that does not go to arbitration first, meaning you can head straight to court, would be if there's a dispute as to the actual title to the real property, the title to the unit, if there's a warranty dispute, you know, if you've just turned over and you have some sort of warranty dispute. If there's a dispute over whether the board properly levied an assessment or properly levied a special assessment, or if there's, of course, a dispute where someone's not paying their assessment, those kind of collection actions don't go to arbitration first. If the association is looking simply to evict or remove a tenant from a property, that can go straight to court. And other types of disputes when a member claims that the board member is breaching their fiduciary duty. For instance, if a board member enters into a contract with the association without the required disclosures and they're claiming conflict of interest, that would be something that the arbitration would not handle. But going back to how we started this talk about mediation, voluntary mediation can happen at any time. So let's say you have a dispute with a member. You don't want to haul off right away and go to arbitration. There's a little bit of a cost to that. You're going to have to get your attorney involved. You can ask that member, if they just won't talk to you and you're just not getting anywhere, you can consider asking the member to go to voluntary mediation first. There are mediators that are reasonably priced. There are in Sarasota and Manatee County, there are free mediators through the clerk of court's office. you can ask someone if they're willing to go to mediation, sit down with a mediator for an hour or two and try to hash out the issue before it escalates into arbitration or a lawsuit. And this is something you can do with an owner. This is something you can suggest to your owners. If you have owner versus owner fighting, you can suggest that they submit their disputes to mediation. And in Manatee, it's called Citizens Dispute Resolution. If you look that up on the Manatee Clerk of Courts website, and it's called something similar in Sarasota, and it's free, and you just sign up and they give you a mediator and talk for an hour and try to solve your problems. But it is voluntary. The other side has to agree to come, and it's something you can use if you have a dispute with a vendor, something like that. Keep that in mind as something to do before it escalates into arbitration or a lawsuit. But if it has escalated, and I have many arbitrations pending right now, because as I said, over this past year, people are just in really bad moods. They're not getting along. They're not doing what they're supposed to do. They're at home, so they're finding all these projects they want to do, and they're not getting the correct approval from the board. And they're not, taking down the things that they did improperly, and everyone's just really fighting these days. And so we do have a lot of arbitrations being filed right now. Before you can file an arbitration, you have to send a pre-arbitration letter, and it has to comply with the statute, and it has to be very specific in nature, and it has to contain some very specific things in that letter. So I would suggest you you try to work with the person, you try to get them to comply. If they're not going to comply, you go to your association counsel and say, we need to send a pre-arbitration letter. And that's the advance notice that says specifically and exactly what they're doing to violate your governing documents, exactly what they have to do to comply with your governing documents, and you give them a reasonable time to comply. And who knows what's reasonable, but talk with your attorney about what the courts have maybe found to be reasonable in the past. And also in that letter, you have to say, if you don't comply with this deadline, we intend to take you to DBPR arbitration. You have to put wording about that in the letter. And unfortunately, you cannot recover your attorney's fees for having written that letter. And you can't write in the letter say, you must comply by this date. If you don't comply, we're going to take you to arbitration. And by the way, you owe us $300 for having to have the attorney write this letter. You cannot charge for that letter. But you can say in the letter, if we have to take you to DBPR arbitration and we prevail, we will ask the arbitrator to award our attorney's fees, meaning the owner would have to pay your attorney's fees for the arbitration action. So that's the pre-arbitration letter. You've sent that out. They don't comply. They dig their heels in, and you have to file the arbitration. And deciding whether to file an arbitration petition is another conversation you should have with your counsel, because you really are tasked with and obligated to enforce your governing documents. You cannot not enforce it over here and enforce it over here. You can't. The selective enforcement is like a dirty word in your world now. You have to treat everyone the same. So if someone has, for instance, we have one right now where they enclose their lanai. It's not allowed, and they didn't get board approval to do any of the work, and they're refusing to take the work out. And that sounds really harsh, but they have to take the work out. They didn't get it approved, and it's not approvable. And the association is really struggling with, do we enforce this? Do we enforce this? And they've decided correctly, yes, they have to enforce it because they are tasked with enforcing their governing documents. Otherwise, it's now open season for everyone to enclose their lanai. So if you have to file the arbitration petition, it is something you should have legal representation on. It's cheaper and faster than going to court. The filing fee to file the arbitration is $50. It hasn't changed in 22 years that I've been doing it. It's still $50, so it's much cheaper than filing a lawsuit. And You file it by sending it. They're not electronic filing up there in Tallahassee yet, so you send it by mail. But the arbitrator then gets your petition, decides if you have correctly sent that pre-arbitration letter, and then the arbitrator looks at it and makes sure it's one of those disputes that the arbitrator can even look at under 718-1255. And if the arbitrator decides, yes, this is a proper dispute, then the arbitrator sends an order to the respondent, meaning the person that you're arguing with, and tells the respondent you have usually 20 days to answer this complaint, this petition. And then it goes from there. It works sort of as like a court case. There are pleadings, there's the petition, there's an answer, there can be a default if they don't answer, but it goes much more rapidly. There's not a lot of discovery. If you want discovery like depositions or documents, you really have to ask permission from the arbitrator, and he or she is not going to allow you to do extensive discovery. They want it to be, here's the problem, here's what I say, here's what they say, here's what the documents say, and the arbitrator decides who's right and who wins. There is a little loophole, and it's mentioned in your materials, that if you're in arbitration and you've got a petition and they've answered and you're working your way towards a final outcome, and the arbitrator says, I think you guys should go to mediation, the arbitrator can order you to mediation. Or if you're working your way through arbitration and it's dragging out and it's costing too much, and you and the respondent think, well, let's see if we can go to mediation. You can halt the arbitration and go to mediation. Or more likely what happens is the arbitrator says, I think you guys need to go to mediation, and she orders you to mediation. Again, mediation is voluntary, but once you've been ordered, you have to show up, but you don't have to do anything other than show up, mediate in good faith. You don't have to settle the issue. You don't have to settle in mediation. However, if you don't settle in mediation, you're in arbitration, you've been ordered to mediation, you've gone to mediation, you didn't settle in mediation, both parties have to agree to go back into the arbitration. If both parties do not agree to go back into the arbitration's over. It's dismissed, it's over, and then the aggrieved party who still has the problem then has to go file it all over again in court. So that's the mediation loophole that I am not a fan of, but it's there, and it could happen to you. If you've gone through arbitration and the arbitrator issues his or her final order, it is a final order. It's a decided final judgment, and it's enforceable. The party who prevails is entitled to payment of their attorney's fees from the party who did not prevail. You have to file a separate attorney fee action. You have to do it within 30 days. And spoiler alert, the arbitrator will not award you all of your attorney's fees. I don't know why, but they have this, and this is a topic that is discussed with the division at lots of legal seminars I go to, of why do you not award the association, because we're usually the ones who prevail. Why don't you award the association all of their attorney's fees? They're out, all of the attorney's fees. And they just take a red pen and slash it, and they think a reasonable hourly fee is about $200 less than a reasonable hourly fee really is. And it's a point of consternation among the legal community, but there's nothing we can do about it. You will get awarded some of your attorney's fees if you prevail in arbitration. But more importantly, you will receive a final order that's enforceable. So now you receive the final order that says, Mr. Jones, you must remove that lanai and put it back in the condition it was in before. And he still doesn't do it. You have an order that you can immediately take to court. The court will adopt that order and enforce it. And the court can enforce it by issuing sanctions, issuing show cause orders, and going all the way to the point of, which I've had to do before, issuing a warrant and incarcerating the person for failing to follow a court order. So it is enforceable, but it all started back in the arbitration, which you had to do under the statute. All right, so just for your edification, HOAs, homeowner associations, do not have this arbitration process at all. DBPR up in Tallahassee does not hear homeowner association arbitrations except for election disputes. They will hear homeowner association election disputes. But the homeowners association, they don't have to go through all of this arbitration because they're not governed by the division. But they are required to demand at least a mandatory pre-suit mediation. So that's their alternative dispute sort of avenue. And there is a real faction out there trying to get the legislature to do away with this whole arbitration process whatsoever, and just going with mandatory pre-suit mediation for condos too. So now that you've learned all that, the legislature might get rid of it. But for now, it is still there, and it's still the way we have to proceed. Some of the sample arbitration decisions that I've put in your outline, enforcing the covenants that were not previously enforced before. You can begin to enforce existing covenants anew if there's a properly amended and implemented uniform policy telling everyone that the existing restrictions were not previously enforced, but we're going to enforce them going forward. And then you can file arbitration actions against the people who are not complying with your policy going forward. You can't wait too long to file the arbitration action. There's a case where more than 8 months passed from the pre-arbitration letter to the filing of the petition, and the petition was dismissed because the arbitrator said you waited too long. So once you send that pre-arbitration letter, you have to be prepared to go forward if they don't comply. I get a lot of questions on smoking. The law on smoking changes, and I think the current state, I haven't checked today, but the current state of the law is typically you can ban smoking. Of course, in your common elements, there are some that believe you can ban smoking on balconies. It's fairly well settled. You cannot ban smoking in someone's personal unit, except if you can really make out a good case that it's a nuisance to the neighbors, and you'd have to go under a nuisance provision there. But anyway, there's arbitration decisions on that. A lot of arbitration decisions on violating nuisance provisions, one of it which I outlined on the last page of your outline, which people like to hear that it's not as bad in their condo as they think. This arbitration, the arbitrator entered a final order requiring the unit owner's child to comply with the documents and stop littering in the common elements, and screaming in the unit, yelling at board members, allowing transients to stay in the unit, appearing nude in the common elements, having sex in the pool, digging up the sod on the common elements, using the pool to wash their pots and pans, leaving the association's outdoor water on, maintaining unsanitary conditions in the unit, which is a very serious thing right now. I have many hoarding cases right now. Covering the windows with prohibited materials, creating disturbances that the police were called to. The thing to get out of that case was that the pre-arbitration letter there, the arbitrator mentioned that you have to be very specific about how they are violating your documents. So if they're doing all these things, you have to list it in the letter and say, don't do this anymore. If you just say, we don't like the way you're behaving, start behaving right, you have to be a lot more specific than that in your pre-arbitration letter. I have like 4 minutes. What docs can we require on an emotional support animal? That's a 2-hour topic of it. If you want to email me, I will send you a little outline that I have, general information. My email is mrh@phkhlaw.com. But yes, in general, for an emotional support animal, you can require a healthcare provider's information stating that the person has a disability, that the disability affects their ability to participate in one or more major life activity, and that the need for the animal is related to the disability. That's in a nutshell what you can ask for. If you have someone making an emotional support animal request, spend the $25 to send it to your lawyer and say, look at this, spend 15 minutes on this, lawyer, and look at this application for an emotional support animal and tell me if it's okay. Because if it's not okay and you're going to ask for more records for an emotional support animal, you have to be very, very, very careful what you ask for. And it's preferable to have your attorney ask for what's legal to ask for. That way, if you ask for something that you couldn't ask for, you can blame it on the attorney. But it's our job to know what you can ask for as far as emotional support animals.
Are both support animals and service animals allowed?
Yes, yes. In
Yeah.
Florida, they are treated the same. They don't care if they don't have any specialized training. They don't need any specialized training. They don't need a badge that they got off the internet. They don't need, an actual service animal, of course, can have all the education and training that they need, but emotional support animals are treated just the same, and they don't require any kind of training or licensing other than a rabies shot.
Support animals allowed by both owners and tenants? Are support animals allowed by both?
Support animals, yes, indeed. You cannot, in fact, you can't treat owners and tenants differently as far as support animals. And even I had a case because the statute says you can't discriminate against someone who is residing in the unit or associated with a person residing in the unit. And we had one whose father came and visited them in their unit routinely, and he had a support animal, and they were able to build a fence that they normally would not have been able to build to put the father's emotional support animal in, and the father didn't even live there, but he was a family member and a frequent visitor, and we had to treat him the same. And yes, somebody just put my email address in
I did. Yeah, I put it up there. We'll take one more question. Does anybody have any more questions at all? Okay, well, I want to say thank you to everyone for participating today. Thank you, Mary, for a very interesting topic. And please allow me just a few days to get the certificates out to everyone, because I'm the one doing them and I have other things going as well. So I will get them out just as quick as I can. And also, please fill out your evaluation forms and email them back to me. It gives the speakers some good feedback. And with that being said, that concludes another one of our condo co-op board certs. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Have a
Bye.
good day.